By 1969, something had shifted in Northern California that people couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was anticipation. Because every time the phone rang at a police station, every time a letter arrived at a newspaper office, every time a strange envelope showed up with a symbol drawn on it, the entire system braced itself for the same name, Zodiac, not because they understood him, but because they expected him. And that expectation is what makes a threat more powerful than the act itself. A known danger can be avoided. An unknown pattern cannot. The letters became more frequent, not random, not emotional, structured like a ritual. Each one followed a rhythm: introduction, claim, puzzle, warning. Then the signature, the symbol that felt less like identity and more like ownership. This is the Zodiac speaking. It was never just a sentence. It was a declaration of presence. And what made it worse was that the killer wasn't simply communicating with police. He was communicating with everyone. Newspapers printed his words. Readers discussed them at breakfast tables. Teenagers tried to decode them like games. Adults tried to ignore them and failed. Because the moment you read his message, you were already part of it. Then came the ciphers. The first major one, the 408-character cipher, was solved by amateurs, not professionals. That alone changed everything. It proved that the killer wasn't untouchable, but it also revealed something more disturbing. The message inside wasn't strategic or defensive. It was personal, a declaration of enjoyment, not just violence, but the emotional experience of it. For investigators, this was a clue. For the public, it was a shock. But for the Zodiac, it was validation. Because now he knew something important. People were trying, and that meant he could keep playing. As pressure increased, so did the complexity of his communication. He began refining his methods: shorter letters, sharper tone, more deliberate structure, less explanation, more control. It was no longer about confessing. It was about directing attention. Every message felt like a move on a chessboard where the opponent couldn't see the full layout. And law enforcement was always reacting one step too late. But the real turning point came in July 1969. Two separate attacks, two different locations, one pattern emerging too clearly to ignore. One of them took place near Blue Rock Springs, another near Lake Berryessa. The second one would become especially infamous, not just because of the violence, but because of how it was executed. This time, the killer didn't simply hide in the shadows. He presented himself, wearing a costume, a hood with a symbol drawn on it, a design that transformed a human being into something unrecognizable, something symbolic, something intentional. Witnesses later described the scene not just as a crime, but as a performance that felt staged, almost ritualistic. And after the act, the killer didn't rush away in panic. He walked, calmly, as if he had finished a task exactly as planned. This is where the psychological profile begins to fracture, because most violent criminals want one thing after an act: distance, escape, separation, disappearance. But the Zodiac seemed to want the opposite: connection, attention, continuation. And that contradiction made him harder to define than almost any case before him. Was he organized or chaotic, calculating or impulsive, a strategist or a performer? The answer, investigators realized, might be all of the above, which is exactly what made him unpredictable. Then came the letters again. One of the most chilling arrived after the Lake Berryessa attack. It contained details only the killer could reasonably know. And yet it wasn't written like a confession. It was written like feedback, as if he was reviewing his own work, explaining it, reinforcing it, as though the act itself was not the endpoint, but part of a continuing narrative he was controlling. The police response intensified. Task forces expanded. Media coverage exploded. Every department in Northern California was now indirectly connected to the same invisible thread. But there was a problem. They had evidence. They had patterns. They had suspects. But they did not have continuity. Every time they believed they were close, the case would shift slightly, like chasing a shadow that learned how to move when you move. And that is where fear becomes operational. Because fear is no longer just emotional. It becomes analytical interference. It distorts decisions. It creates urgency where patience is required. And the Zodiac understood that. Even if he didn't consciously design it that way, he was benefiting from it. By late 1969, the communication escalated again. This time more aggressive, more direct threats, demands for publication, instructions for solving codes, and always the reminder. This is the Zodiac speaking. It was repetition as domination. The more often you hear a name, the more real it becomes, even if the person behind it remains unseen. And then came the moment that changed everything about public perception. The killer sent letters containing new ciphers, more complex than before. One of them would remain unsolved for decades, not because it was impossible, but because it was incomplete in meaning. It didn't just hide a message, it hid intent. And intent is harder to decode than language. At this stage, something subtle began to happen in the public mind. The Zodiac was no longer being discussed as a person. He was being discussed as a system failure, a gap in law enforcement capability, a challenge to modern policing itself. And that shift matters, because when a criminal becomes symbolic, the fear expands beyond geography. It becomes cultural. Investigators pursued every lead. One name kept appearing in reports and interviews: Arthur Lee Allen, a man with questionable history, suspicious associations, and circumstantial links that made him a long-term focus of investigation. But even intense scrutiny never produced a definitive confirmation, and without confirmation, suspicion becomes endless. Meanwhile, the letters continued, then slowed, then paused, not stopped completely, but reduced. And that reduction created something even worse than fear: uncertainty. Because when a threat disappears without explanation, people don't feel relief, they feel expectation. By the end of 1969, the Zodiac had already achieved something rare in criminal history. He had committed violence. He had communicated directly with the public. He had introduced unsolved codes that challenged experts for decades. And most importantly, he had remained unidentified. In the next part, the story moves into the most disturbing phase of the case: the investigation spiral, the psychological profiling attempts, and the moment authorities began realizing something unsettling. They weren't just trying to catch a killer anymore. They were trying to understand a mind that might not fit any known category of human behavior. And that realization changed everything.